Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge. So we just had our 9th wedding anniversary a couple days ago.
That's right.
Right. And we got married on this 2 years after we met on the same day. So we met 11 years ago, and then exactly 2 years later, we got married. It also happens to be right between yours and my birthday. So I guess I'm going to date this podcast by giving out specific times. Sorry.
Well, I mean, it's still going to be the same date every year, depending on the year.
Yeah, it's true. So we met October 15th. Your birthday is October 6th, and my birthday is October 22nd. And so I am 11 and a half months older than you are.
You deceived me. I thought I was marrying somebody my same age.
That's right. I deceived you. So we met when we were both 32. You had just turned 32. And I was just about to turn 33. And we met...
Way back in 2010.
That's right, way back in 2010. So October 15th is the day we met. And then 2 years later, in 2012, we got married on October 15th. And we had what's called a Quaker wedding, which is something that the only state in the country of the United States that has a provision for a Quaker wedding is Pennsylvania. And it's a wedding you can perform on your own by yourself, meaning that you don't have to have anybody officiating. You don't even have to have anybody there. But the burden of proof that you did truly get married is on you. So you have to have somebody sign the paper, like sign the license. So you and I got married together.
We're not Quakers, by the way.
We're not Quakers. We just thought it was cool.
We live in the Quaker state, but we're not Quakers.
That's right. Yes, exactly. So you can have a Quaker wedding without being a Quaker. So we, the only person who was there was Piper. She was about 3 months old. And you and I had both been married before and had the big weddings in our first marriages. And we wanted something that was a little bit more intimate and something that was just the two of us. And then afterwards we had your brother and sister-in-law sign the paper, but we exchanged our vows alone. And I don't know, in proper emo style, we were in a cemetery. And we did that on purpose. It was in the fall. We went to a cemetery that was relatively close to our house. It was within walking distance. We did that to remind ourselves that life is short and to seize the day. And then we exchanged vows. And the reason why all of that was able to happen is because we met at an event. We've talked about this before. It was around neuro-linguistic programming. And they said repeatedly at the event, be not me. Like, if you want to really understand the plasticity of the mind, if you want to understand how malleable it is, you behave in ways that are contrary to your identity, to how you see yourself. And so then you think in terms of be not me. So what does that mean to be not me? Well, the reason why we met is because I was not the kind of person who would go hit on somebody at a conference. It was not me to go hit on this really cute guy that was across the room who stood out like a sore thumb, in my opinion. And being not me, I decided I was going to come hit on you. And I did. I came and hit on you, and it worked. I was successful. And now 11 years later, we're still together. But I often think that moment wasn't just a moment in which I met the love of my life. It was a moment in which I successfully reflected back to myself that when I insistently follow the narratives of my mind, when I believe that I have to be whatever my stories are of myself, that I miss out on a ton of opportunity. I miss out on understanding other aspects of who I am. So in some ways, the be not me mantra, it encouraged me to behave in ways that were inconsistent with stories I had told of myself about who and what I am. But it wasn't inconsistent with elements of myself that was still living inside. Like when I went and hit on you, Joel, I was being not my stories, but I was still being me. And I've since thought a lot about that. What does it mean to be not me? What does it mean to expand your behavior beyond whatever your narratives and stories of yourself are? And what opportunities live there? What opportunities live when you get outside of whatever that role is or that mask is or that persona or whatever it is that you think that you have to be consistent with? What are all the opportunities that live outside of that?
I was at the same conference hearing the same message, and I was also attempting to be not me in those moments. And so I was receptive to you coming up and hitting on me, because I think in my past self, even a week before I'd heard that message, I probably been very careful. I would have had a lot of boundaries up, a lot of barriers for you to get past to even have the conversation to be able to hit on me. I mean, I would have allowed the banter to happen, but nothing would have gone further than that. But I allowed the experience to develop immediately and connect in a romantic way immediately. Like that day and forward, I just let myself go into it, which was very different than I was normally wired to be from my background. You know, technically at the time I'd been separated for 2 years, but I was still legally married. And the faith background I came from and all the cultural support structure around me would not be okay with me being married and talking to somebody that I was attracted to, right? It's just, even if it was a separation, it was headed for divorce most likely at that time, hadn't been together for 2 years, it still was not okay. So I was out of my me, quote unquote, as well. And then I also have been thinking about this lately too. Like that's just the story from the past, years ago. And I realized that I think I have a sense of consistency with how I show up in the world. And I don't know if it's a core value necessarily. I don't know if it goes that deep, but it might as well be, because it's informed most of my life. And I think it informs most people's lives. They think they have to be consistent for what they presented. And we call people that aren't crazy or dangerous or toxic or whatever. If I say one thing, if I behave in a certain way today and tomorrow I behave in a completely different way, people will say I have a problem. There's something wrong with me because I'm not consistent with how I'm signaling to everybody my intent and my essence of how I show up to the world. So this is something I've grappled with. It's like, and I noticed that people we coach and client, like some of our clients and customers and students, as we're working with them in coaching situations, there's a lot of this consistency stuff that comes up. It's like, well, I can't do that because I haven't been doing that. It's like this allegiance to a consistent signal every day of the life. And it's almost like change has to happen gradually, because if it's too abrupt, I'm not consistent or congruent with who I've been.
Right. And I like that question, because what are you being consistent with? Is it consistency of behavior because that's just your pattern? Is it consistency with a mask or a persona or an image you're putting out into the world? Is it consistency with a story that you tell about yourself of who you are? Or is it consistency with your values or your belief structures? And I think some of those are more and less noble. And I think we tell ourselves that all of them are noble, that consistency itself is noble. And I think that when I look at it through the lens of like the 4 Jungian archetypes we've been talking about a lot lately, this idea of persona, ego, shadow, and self. We talked about it in our 400th podcast episode. I think a lot of us believe that we're supposed to be consistent with our ego, like the good news, right? All the good, positive stuff. And I think some of us believe we have to be consistent with the persona, the mask, like the image that we're showing to the rest of the world or the way that we want to interface with them. And I suspect that we believe we're being consistent with self when we do that. But a lot of these narratives, a lot of these stories we tell about ourselves that live in our egos. I'm a good person, right? I'm a good person. I want what's best for people, right? Like all these stories about what it means to be a good person and what it means to be consistent with all of that. Or we tell ourselves, you know, what our values are, and maybe our values haven't really been reevaluated much since maybe childhood, where our values are sort of given to us, right? And we adopted them from others, and we feel this need to be consistent with those values. Or just, as you mentioned, just consistency in general to signal to other people that we're reliable, that there's a sense of reliability. And I think as I consider these aspects, you know, the 4 Jungian archetypes of persona, ego, shadow, and self, they are like you can't really do one-to-one correlations on personality type. It's entirely inappropriate to do that. We've been working with Dr. John Beebe John has this 8-function model that talks about our ego being associated, the 4 parts of our ego are associated with the first 4 functions in our cognitive function stack, and our shadow has some relationship to the 4 shadow functions we have. But the more we work with John and the more I dive into it, it's not that there's a one-to-one correlation. It's that these are access points for understanding how we're going to, or what kind of relationship we're going to have with these parts of who we are. Like when I'm in my shadow, when I'm in my opposing personality, introverted intuition is going to be a tool I grab, right? And it's there's some reliability of me grabbing that tool. But introverted intuition is not my shadow. And my 4 shadow functions are not my shadow. They're just a way of understanding. It's just another map or a model to understand that there's access points there, or maybe some ways that we will predictably show up. So I want to make it clear that personality type, particularly the cognitive functions, which we tend to dive into because we believe that that's the meat of the system, is not synonymous with self. It's an aspect of self. Self is much, much bigger than these 8 functions, or even the 4 that we most identify with. And yet I do believe that there are ways that we trend to show up, like trend, when we use certain functions more often than others. And there's going to be elements of ourselves that we can diagnose from the outside. When I'm trying to be consistent with self, what does that look like? And how is it going to show up depending upon my personality type? And I don't know if I want to go through a one-to-one, this is how this cognitive function is going to show up when it comes to persona, self, blah, 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 blah. Like, I think that might be an inappropriate use of the tool. But I do want to have a bit of a conversation of the kinds of things that might show up depending upon type or depending upon what lens you look through, and some of the attachments a person might have, some of the ways that it might manifest for them when they're trying to be consistent with self, when they're trying to show up in a way that signals to others that they're not, like you mentioned, all over the place or crazy or toxic or whatever. And maybe some of the ways that our narratives about ourselves are not serving us, right? Like if we have these attachments depending upon the functions that we most rely on day to day and we have the most certainty around, what are the things that we're going to tend to attach to more so than other things? And is there a way that we can let go of those attachments and be not me?
I'll start with my introverted feeling authenticity judging function is an ENFP. It's my co-pilot or auxiliary function. And I think that at one time I thought, well, introverted feeling authenticity, that is the definition of being able to see the shadow. Like really, I can see the darkness in me. I can see the dark parts. I can see the parts that aren't, as honorable, or they're a little shady. They want what they want. They manipulate in the ways they want to manipulate. And as an introverted feeling authenticity user, I have a lot of pride and ego around my ability to really see my dark parts, to see my shadow.
Right.
And the more I've been working with John Beebe and some of this, I think there's a little bit of a distinction between that function, which we talk about seeing the dark parts, and what the actual shadow is. I think the introverted feeling, like you talked about, is a tool, and it might have a little more close association with more shadowy elements because it's introverted. Like it's certainly going to see more of the inner terrain than an extroverted thinking cognitive function or effectiveness is going to see. That's extrovertedly focused. So this is going to certainly have more touch points with the inner space, the inner terrain. And so your judging function, Antonia, of introverted thinking. However, it still has its limitations. It's just a tool. It's a cognitive wiring of my mind. It's not the actual shadow itself. It's an access point, like you mentioned, to see some of these things. But I'm sure there's a ton of my shadow that I cannot really get my head around just with this function. There's something else that allows me to access some of the parts of me that aren't just darkness, maybe outwardly focused, but they're darkness inwardly focused. They're evilly undermining to myself. They're putting myself in double binds. They're attacking me from within. And sometimes that's harder to get a hold of. Like the shadow, I always want to think is kind of like, oh, that's the bad thing, has to be contained or it'll hurt others. It's almost like that's my ego boasting about it in a way, like it's so dark and dangerous. It also can attack me in a lot of ways. It can really undermine me in a lot of ways. It can make me believe that I'm doing work and getting into the ego and developing it more than I maybe really am. It puts, it can trick me. Now, it is not in my shadow. I want to be clear. What I'm saying here is not, I'm probably confusing somebody who's like, wait a minute, your introverted feeling is not down in the shadow at all, Joel. You're using it as a strength, right? It's your parent in John Beebe's model. It's your co-pilot auxiliary function. I'm not suggesting it's in my shadow. I'm just saying that as an introverted feeling user, I have thought most of my life that I'm more in touch with this aspect of myself because this is a strength than maybe other people have reported. And I've always been like, man, it kind of feels weird to have this relationship with. I don't know how it shows up for you, Antonia, specifically in your introverted thinking. Do you feel like you have access to these things as well because you're inwardly focused there?
I think that introverted thinking has a capacity to understand the depth of self-trickery that people engage in a way that other functions struggle to really understand. And I mean, like, on myself. Like you see the dark parts of your heart, I see the dark parts of my thoughts. And dark not as in brings darkness to the world, but rather people trick themselves into believing things all the time. And I don't just mean like I have fantasies of being a sniper and picking evil people off at a distance or anything. Like, I mean, I do, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm more talking about the ways that people manipulate their own minds so that they can always think of themselves as being right. Like, people believe everything they think. And while that might not seem like it's the darkness of the heart, it leads to all sorts of terrible acts. It leads to lots of darkness. So I think that I think introverted thinking is more tapped into that. But to go back to what you were talking about with introverted feeling or authenticity, there's a challenge that this function has, that while it might have a strength in being able to see all of these different parts of an individual and see the dark parts, it also simultaneously is highly idealistic and really likes to paint itself in as positive a light as possible. So while it may have more instinctive access to being able to see this shadow, it also simultaneously has more attachment of staying in ego. So by that I mean the ego is all the good news about us. And I don't mean it means that, or the ego doesn't think we're perfect, but it believes everything we're doing is justifiable. The ego wants to see everything we do as justifiable and being from positive intent. And that is one of the biggest challenges introverted feeling has, is that it wants to believe that everything it's doing is from positive intent. In fact, if you accuse somebody who uses this function of having ill intent, they'll get real salty real quick. So yeah, it can see the shadow, but that doesn't mean it's integrating or contending with it or really sitting with it. And introverted thinking might also see darker parts of who we are, but that doesn't mean it ever acknowledges that the darker parts are corrupting its information or data, right? And so these introverted judging functions do more internal exploration. They see more territory inside. Depending upon where they sit, you'll have more certainty about what you're seeing and more confidence in your diagnosis. But that doesn't mean that you're going to be able to integrate or process those dark parts, meaning that you might be able to see it, but there's always a justification for why it's there. There's always some reason why that darkness lives inside of you. There's always some reason why you're not ultimately or fundamentally wrong for having it. And that's one of the biggest challenges, is that when you're really contending with these parts of who you are, if you really want to get to a place of self where you've integrated all of this and more, it means you've got to just sit with those parts of who you are without judgment. You have to accept them. You have to process them. You have to go, oh yeah, I'm a monster also, right? Not I see the dark parts of me, but I'm a fundamentally good person. That's still all judgment. It's I see the dark parts of me, full stop, period. That's it. There's no justification after that. So these introverted judging functions sometimes really contend with seeing, but then turning a blind eye. Seeing, but then creating a narrative or story around why it's okay. And these are the narratives and stories we get caught up in. So now we have to be consistent with the narrative and story. I see the dark part of me, but I'm a fundamentally good person, and narrative, story. This is why I had to do every terrible dark thing I ever did. This is why I'm a terrible person sometimes, but it's totally justified because narrative, story. And then now we have to be consistent with that. Now we have to behave in a way that's consistent with all these narratives and stories. And we get attached to them. We get attached to our internal justifications for why we might be monsters, which we all are. We all have a dark part. We're all monsters. Full stop, period. No, but it's okay. There is no it's okay. It just is. So I think one of the big challenges when you're doing the kind of work we're talking about, using these introverted judging functions can be there's talent there, but that doesn't mean there's skill development. It can be a help. It can be an assist, a tool, a very powerful tool to go internal and do this work of seeing, but then you have to temper its desire to justify, which is where it almost invariably ends up going.
As we talk about this idea of consistency, I realize I want other people to be consistent with what they signal to me. I really do, because it's how I build trust with somebody. If they act and behave one way for like the first 4 weeks I meet them, let's say we hire a new employee into our business, or we hire a consultant or something, and they say, hey, I have this skill set and this is how I show up, and they start to do that role and they start to be that way. And then within 4 weeks, all of a sudden they're doing something radically different. I'm like, well, now you can't be in that role anymore. Like, that role requires you to be like this. I don't really trust that you're going to be able to do the job anymore. Or if it's a personal relationship, a friendship, or a romance, I would want that person to also be consistent. I would want them to be them. So I know what can I expect tomorrow when I wake up. I think if you are in a relationship with somebody, a friendship with somebody, or a business arrangement with somebody, they wake up different every morning, not them, quote unquote, you don't get a lot of traction with people like that. So I think we all want each other to be consistent, and we know that about each other. Like, I know I want you, Antonia, to be consistent in our relationship. Tomorrow, I want you to love me when I wake up. I want you to be happy we've been married as long as we've been together. Like, I want all those things to be true. And if you behaved radically different from that tomorrow, you weren't you, that would be really challenging for me, I think.
Well, I also think that's almost impossible for a person to truly behave that way. Like, even if you've got some neurosis going on, you're usually pretty consistent with even that. Like, I don't think people swap out identities that quickly. To be not you is usually like a slice, right? In this one way, in this one narrative or story you have about yourself. How could you be not you in this one way, this one story that you believe you have to be faithful to, particularly if it's not serving you? So we're kind of having two tracks here. One side of the conversation is how our cognitive functions relate to our sense of identity and self, and what are the kinds of things that they might attach to, particularly narratives and stories. And then on the other side is, how are these narratives and stories encouraging us to be consistent with behaviors that might not be serving us in the long run? Because that's almost always the things that people go back and reflect on. Like, if I want to be not me, I'm not going to choose all the great stuff, all the stuff I really like about myself and other people seem to like and helps me foster good relationships and get high ROI and success and achievement and all that stuff. Like, I'm not going to go sabotage those. Those are the good ones. Not until they run out, not until all of a sudden they're not getting me the desired, emergent that I want. Then I'll start reevaluating them. But in the meantime, if I like that part and you like that part and it seems to be working out okay, that's not the thing I'm going to be like, well, maybe I shouldn't be a kind person anymore. I'll be not me and be a dick, right? I've been a dick before. It's not good. I had to reevaluate that one. I had to train myself into being a kind person, and I'm glad I did that work. So I think when we talk about being consistent with these narratives and stories and be not me, we are talking about the things that aren't serving us. The parts of ourselves that really could use a reevaluation, really could be something that's not the healthiest or not getting our end games accomplished. And they're usually very associated with narratives and stories. So talking about the introverted functions, the introverted judging functions are the ones that are going to rationalize when they see ourselves, when they see a bigger picture of who we are. And they sometimes get disturbed when they do that inner spelunking, right? That inner work sometimes comes up with some disturbing information. Oftentimes, it gets rationalized away, and we become attached to the rationalization, to the story we tell ourselves of why it's okay that those parts exist inside of ourselves. And that rationalization or narrative or story requires us to behave consistently with it in order to keep the story of the rationalization going. So, for example, if I am if I'm a person who lacks integrity in relationships, then I might have a narrative or story that tells me that the reason why I lack integrity in relationships is because I wasn't treated well when I was young. So I have a couple, maybe I didn't have good models in front of me, or I had people who were really unkind to me, or maybe I was cheated on at one point as an adult. And so if I lack integrity in relationships and I source it back to, well, that's how people have treated me, then now it's okay because I've rationalized it away. And now I get to be consistent with that story, right? Like now I have to be consistent with the story that I was wronged and I was treated wrongly. And now I don't have to contend directly with my lack of integrity. Now I just have to be consistent with the story that I have been wronged. Does that make sense? It's like the challenge of those introverted judging functions is that they will give us rationalizations we can attach to so we don't have to look directly and contend with the darker elements that live inside of us for fear of judging them, right? We don't want to judge ourselves. We don't want other people to judge us. And this idea of like going, I'm not a good friend or I'm not a good partner. And then just full stop. No judging on that. No doing anything beyond, just acknowledging, no, I'm actually pretty bad at that. And then no narrative to be consistent with. No story, no get out of jail free card, right? Just that. That's just how I am. So then I have a choice. If I look at that directly and I process it, and of course, when you go down that road, you get like the bad stomach ache, you get like the hot flash, and you're like, oh, I'm kind of a bad human being, or whatever is the feeling that comes over you. Saying you're a bad human being is a judgment. You don't have to go there. But if you just sit with I do not show up in relationships. I just don't. If I don't attach a narrative or story that gives me a get out of jail free card, that allows me to behave consistent with a story or a narrative, if I just accept it, now I have a choice. Do I want to stay that kind of person, or do I want to do something about it? And the challenge with the introverted judging functions is that while they might see that kind of thing directly, their autoresponder is to immediately go into rationalization. So that's the part that has to be reined in. The part that has to be mitigated is the narrative that follows, is the story that follows that makes it okay that you're fill in the blank, not the kind of person that you want to be.
Well, if the two introverted judging functions, there's 4 judging functions, 2 are introverted, 2 are extroverted. The 2 introverted judging functions, introverted thinking, accuracy, introverted feeling, authenticity. If these 2 functions can rationalize and inwardly gerrymander how we see ourselves to ensure we're always in the best light, or at least that's what they want to do, we can get leverage on that and get a hold of it. But if that's what they want to do, if we talk about the other 2 judging functions, extroverted thinking or effectiveness and extroverted feeling and harmony, these are both interfacing with the outer world. These aren't about getting in touch with the inner space and our internal judgments. These are external judgments, how the world is set up relationally and systems-wise. And this is going to be much less about the darkness of the thought or the heart. This is really the temptation here is not the retcon gerrymandering side of things inwardly. The challenge here is the outward persona or mask we wear and the adjustments that we make and expect others to make consistently. Out here, right? There's like a societal expectation of how you show up. I mean, on real basic stuff, like you should have clothes on your body, you should have your hair done, you should look presentable, not have dirt on your face, your hands should be washed. Like all these things, just basic things that society requires of us or asks of us, all the way up to higher level things like the kinds of things we can talk about, what we can mention in polite company, the subject matter we can address, how we talk to somebody, like the manners we have. Like all of these things are persona expectations collectively. And I think there is a lot of danger there just to be I watched this political ad recently with this politician who's running for office in our state. And I mean, it turned my stomach watching this person smile. Everything was so perfectly presentable. Like they were dressed perfectly, hair was done perfectly, the smile was pinned on. It just looked so fake and constructed. Like I'm just like, oh my gosh, like what? Like who is going to vote for this person? Like this is horrible. And yet I know that most of our interactions in the world are persona interactions, like mask wearing interactions. They're probably doing the exact thing that they need to do as a politician to get elected. Like this is probably perfect. I could never do. It would drive me crazy to be like that. It looks so inauthentic to me.
Yeah, I think most people want their politicians to be sort of cardboard cutouts that have a bullet list of all their favorite issues and being on their side of their favorite issues.
So true.
Yeah, like I don't think we want politicians to be much more than persona.
We don't want them to think for themselves.
Yeah, heck no. You represent my interests. Absolutely. So yeah, I think that is the challenge. You know, you're talking about all the things that we're allowed to say in polite society and how we're supposed to show up, and that would be a lot of extroverted feeling, like or harmony. It's like the challenge with this is the narrative that we want to construct of the kind of person we are, you know, and the kind of values we have, that we're caring and that we're kind and that we're looking out for each other.
Systemically.
Yeah, systemically, exactly. And that we're going to bake this into our unspoken social contracts, and that this is the kind, you know, these are the kinds of people we expect each other to be. And then on the side of extroverted thinking or effectiveness, it might be a little bit more of like, what kind of civil servant am I, and how am I going to show up to support the system, and how am I going to show up with duty, and also what are my signals of success going to be, like what kind, you know, like how much of a contributing member of society am I, and how much has society rewarded me by giving so much value? Like if I have all these markers of value back, that must mean that I've given a lot of value up front, and so I have a lot of value to give. So what kind of car am I driving, or what kind of position do I have? What's my status? So a lot of these things can be baked into those extroverted judging functions, and the challenge there is not the narrative, like you mentioned, not the narrative we're telling ourselves, but it's the narrative we're telling other people. And we can get caught up in having to be consistent with those narratives. That would be much closer to what's called role-person merger, where the role that we take on in society, or the roles that we take on with our positions or our job, or, you know, like who we are in our relational dynamics, that is as much of ourselves as we can see. And we have to be consistent with that story, the story that we tell ourselves of who we are and how we fit in society. And some of that's perfectly fine. And we need to interface with others. We need other people to believe certain things about us in order to get our accomplishments achieved and to get the relationships that we want. I mean, my goodness, if we really interfaced with each other at like the holistic self level, I think it would be, well, first of all, it'd be overwhelming. And second of all, I think that none of us could really contend with each other. like we'd all have to be at this really ascended level of mastery to be able to get to that place where we could interface with the wholeness of self piece of everyone.
Well, we can't even interface with ourselves holistically yet.
Yeah, that's really hard work that most people don't do. So
it's not going to happen outwardly yet.
Yeah, the idea of everybody doing that with each other is ridiculous. So on some level, that persona or mask, you know, it serves us. But just like the narratives that we tell ourselves that are the rationalizations so that we don't have to see the bad, quote unquote, bad news. And then we act consistent with those rationalizations. And now we're stuck in a hamster wheel of, like you mentioned, gerrymandering and self-rationalizations. And now we can't get out of that. Now we can't change and become the kind of person we want to become, because that means we have to look ourselves in the face first without rationalizing. Then the same thing can happen with these role-person merger situations, that we feel like we have to be consistent with the image that we're giving to other people. And on some level, that's true in the sense of like if I come to a job and I say, hey, I'm the kind of person who's a hard worker and I will do well for your company. And then within a couple of weeks, we're slacking off. No, we've not been consistent with that persona. Now we might have gotten our foot in the door and now we become like C-player employees, which is, you know, I mean, I guess a person can do that, but that's not particularly fair. So if we present ourselves in a certain way, there is an amount of consistency expected from the outside world from us, that we will be the kind of people we're advertising ourselves to be. And we can also start to buy into an image and attach ourselves to these narratives, particularly if we aren't that person underneath. if we are more focused on the sizzle than the steak, if we're more focused on the image we're presenting, and we're kind of hoping we'll fake it until we make it or something to that effect, but we never actually make it, that is definitely a danger. The danger being that we're more focused on the persona, other mask part of who we are, and adjusting our masks so that's what everybody always sees, than actually being an authentic, honest person. And behaving inconsistently with that role or behaving inconsistently with some of those narratives and stories can be healthy for us. Like you and I, we're not the kind of people who, I was not the kind of person who would hit on you, and you were not the kind of person who would let me. Why? In large part because of our personas, because of the mask that we had been given by the people that had raised us and influenced us. We had been told, you never present yourself in this way. Like, don't let the outside world ever believe all of these things they'll believe about you if you're inconsistent with this role. So I went, okay, in order to not be thought of as XYZ, I can't ever hit on the dude who's super cute sitting across from me in the room, or maybe I can hit on him, but I can't go any further than that or whatever. Being not me in that moment was actually being me. That's the weird thing. Being not me was actually pointing out that the persona I was wearing, the mask I was wearing, the image I was presenting was actually not me. The me I was the person who behaved the way that I did. And I discovered it that day. So behaving in a way that goes against your persona and mask can sometimes be the best mechanism to reflect back to you whether or not you're just in a role person merger or if that is actually who you are. And you'll know that as soon as you do it. You'll not the social censure, not the outside feedback, not the embarrassment, but upon reflection going, no, I think that was in alignment with me. I think that was consistent with me.
We will be right back. If you're focused on personal growth, I think you'll resonate with our core content over at personalityhacker.com. We want to see you understand how your mind is wired so you can generate motivation, improve social skills, find career opportunities, and master excellent decision making. But a quick warning, we are advice and action focused in all of our articles, podcasts, and videos. This means that we attract people who like to be challenged to become excellent, to take action, to put in the work to optimize themselves, not simply just gather more information. If you are committed to personal growth and ready to radically find your inner truth, then come over and be a part of our growing community of like minds at Personality Hacker. Now back to the show. The idea of a persona being me and being not me is something beside that persona. Like, I don't think I thought of it that way at the NLP conference, the way you just stated it, that the true me was behind that mask. I didn't perceive myself to be wearing a mask. So that was the first piece, is it really felt like the mask was me. And I think the other piece of this is I was at a place in my life where my life was collapsing around me. The scaffolding that was holding that mask in place was deteriorating. Like, my marriage I'd been separated for a while, that was falling apart. My relationship to my faith background was being reevaluated. It was eroding in the traditional sense of what I'd believed, and other things were coming into my awareness. All sorts of beliefs about money and business and success. These were all eroding around me. And so there was a very thin, fragmented, barely there scaffolding holding up the persona. And I still thought it was me, though, at the moment. And I can't imagine, with a strong scaffolding being in place, the work or bravery or even ability for me to get to a different part of myself. Like, how would that even been possible? I think this is why people, when trauma happens or when they're going through a divorce or a life change, maybe middle age, anywhere between the ages of like 35 and 55, a lot of our clients and students are in that age range, because this is kind of when you start to go, wait a second, I've been living a certain life, and maybe the structure that supported that starts to break down around you. And then you're like, wait a minute, am I wearing a mask? Is this like not even my thing? Holy cow. Like, I don't believe this. I don't want to be this person. I don't want to do this job. Holy mother of goodness. This is crazy. I need to reevaluate everything. I don't know how hard it is to be able to do this work without the scaffolding eroding, because my experience was it eroded for me to be able to see it and be able to actually be able to, quote, be not me. So that's the first thing that came to my mind as I was thinking about this. Is I don't know if it's probably pretty challenging if you're in persona and wearing a mask, and you think that is you. How do you know any different? Unless you try stuff and you kind of discover it. Again, I think trauma and things breaking down is the way this can often happen for people, because it happens to you. You don't get a choice. And so that's one challenge. But I think that a lot of people have an experience of the scaffolding breaking down. And the other thing is lateral moves can happen. It can happen. Oh my gosh, my scaffold is breaking down. My persona mask is going to fall apart here. I need to find something else to hold this up. I got to immediately jump into another community or another faith background or another relationship or something. And I'll take any persona mask I can. I don't care as long as I have one. I mean, it's unconscious. We don't do this consciously. And then we run into something else and we attach all these things and we're like, okay, I feel okay now again. Like I've got it all there. The mask is in place and I'm going to be all right. And it's almost like we're addicted to a mask. We don't even care what the mask is, as long as it's something that's not us, because we're terrified of that part of us in a way. And I don't know if it's just the darkness. I'm not exactly sure what we're terrified of, because the mask gets rejected. But I guess it's always, we can rationalize, like the ego for the darkness, the shadow. The ego can rationalize the mask too. It's like, well, that wasn't really me. If I gave 100%, that would have been me. But I gave 80%. That was my persona giving the 80% in that context or whatever. So the hurts don't hurt as bad because it's just the mask they're punching against.
Yeah. This goes back to the firm model in my mind when you said, what is the thing that we're afraid of? I think one thing that the firm model has done for me is help me understand what it is ultimately that we're running away from. We haven't talked about the perceiving functions yet. We just talked about the judging functions. And I think it's because it's easier to see how those show up for us when it comes to trying to be consistent with certain values, because those are the values functions. The judging functions are the ones that are the values functions. So how they encourage us to hold on to values narratives, including I'm a good person, or however, whatever the value is. The judging functions are going to be the ones that are the easiest to spot how we cling to them. And they're going to be the ones who help us, create these stories and narratives and these rationalizations, whether that's introverted or extroverted functions.
Yeah.
But I think what happens with the perceiving functions is that we're more consistent with them, less through story and more through just sort of saying things like, I'm the kind of person that ... Like as a person who uses extroverted intuition or exploration, I'm a person that tends to get bored really easy. I'm a person that tends to forget a lot of stuff and have to reinvent the wheel all the time. And I'm the kind of person that tends to love problem solving. And I'm the kind of person that ... right? And so in some ways, I feel like I have to be consistent with this thing I've learned about myself or I understand about myself. And I think that introverted sensing or memory, which is my inferior function, I've traditionally in the past never found any story that made introverted sensing part of my story, part of my narrative of who I am. Now I understand it's a massive part of who I am, right? Now that and I'm talking about like before I knew what functions were. I could tell you all the things about being extroverted intuition without even knowing that function existed. I couldn't tell you anything about introverted sensing except for the things I didn't like in other people or qualities or characteristics I didn't particularly enjoy. Now I understand that introverted sensing is a big piece of who I am. It just shows up in a way that is different than how the stories I created around my identity of using extroverted intuition or exploration. So what I mean by that is we feel like we have to be consistent with our perceiving functions in less of a narrative or story way of values and more of a I'm just the kind of person that ... Does that make sense? I think somebody who uses introverted intuition or perspectives is going to very much see themselves as the kind of person that plans a lot or feels like they have to measure twice, cut once, or the kind of person who sees other people's viewpoints and perspectives and understands where other people are coming from and feels the need to be consistent with that kind of behavior. Extroverted sensation people are going to see themselves as, maybe being effervescent or needing to be in motion or highly kinesthetic, or somebody who sees reality for what it is and accepts it, or is somebody who really lives in the moment. All of these elements that they'll have identified themselves. And I think an introverted sensing will be the kind of person that ... believes that, the family is really important, and there are reasons for established traditions, and can identify all the things in their lives that are very important to them, and all the things that mean something, right? And that they know that they're the product of where they came from, and they really understand point of origin and those kinds of things. So I think we end up being less values oriented there, and just more, I have to be consistent with this style or modality of being. And the reason why I say that is because it makes me think of the FIRM model that we've talked about before, and we wrote a little bit about in our book. And FIRM stands for freedom, invulnerability, rightness, and management. And these are 4 styles of fixations that people have depending upon the personality type. If you're an EP type, freedom tends to be a fixation, and we want to be consistent with the kind of person who is free, and we believe we have to be that way. And the fear is anybody who's trying to take our freedom away from us. So when you say, what is somebody ultimately fearing when they're not consistent with who they are, when they let go of some of these narratives? As an EP type, one of the biggest problems I had is that I was afraid that I would be bound. But what's interesting is that when I was in the depths of my narratives and trying to be consistent with my persona and my self-rationalizations, I was more imprisoned than at any other time period. Right? Like I was more bound to these narratives and stories. It wasn't until I stopped being, quote, me, when I was not me, that I started realizing that I had the freedom to behave however I wanted to. Like I literally could behave however I wanted to. So then the ways that I started showing up and the ways that I was consistent were things that were more honest for me. Like they were me. They weren't something that I had outsourced. I think for IJ types are the invulnerability types. I think ultimately the fear is that they'll be vulnerable, right? That they're not going to be safe in some way, however they're defining safety. And so what ends up happening is when IJ types feel like they have to be consistent with that idea, they end up lacking courage in whatever way. Sometimes it's not courage to try new things. Sometimes it's courage to open your heart up or show somebody something beyond your persona. Sometimes IJ types are the worst at putting masks on, pinning on smiles, right? Because my God, what if somebody sees who they really are deep inside? Like, that's terrifying. They're vulnerable now. And so I think for IJ types, that's the thing that they're ultimately fearing. And so they're consistent with that persona in order to not be vulnerable and expose their heart and have somebody laugh at them or tell them that they're not good enough or become important to them and then reject them. I think that's a big one. For R types, those are IPs. Rightness is the fixation. And for IP types, I think at the end of the day, they're afraid that their self-rationalization is wrong. We talked about that retconning. You can see all the dark parts, but you've got to turn off the mechanism that your introverted judging function of introverted thinking accuracy, your introverted feeling authenticity, it's going to want to continue the dialogue beyond seeing the dark part and give some rationalizations. And the fear is that you're fundamentally wrong. You're not right. You're either bad or wrong for introverted feeling, or you're stupid and wrong for introverted thinking, right? Your thoughts are wrong. So that's fundamentally the fear is that your rationalizations are meaningless, right? They're not accurate. They're not right.
Well, and if you're right, you won't have the right to speak up or say it because you don't have the correct information or stance on this.
Right, exactly. Like you will no longer be given. You won't give yourself permission to express because you'll be racked with doubt or indecisiveness or whatever. And for EJs, it's management. The fear is ultimately that they're going to be out of control of their environment, that they want to manage the things around them. And so if your persona, right, the EJ type, or excuse me, the extroverted judging functions that are the dominant functions of the EJ types or the driver functions, the challenge there is if people see behind the mask or the persona, maybe they won't respect you enough to do what you tell them to do. Or maybe they won't respect you enough to stay in relationship with you and allow you to guide the dynamic. Now everything's going to be a mess, right? You'll be out of control and you won't be able to manage your life. And all of these things, this is the oversimplification of it all, right? These are just models that help us access some of these things that are going on for us. They're not by any stretch of the imagination a fleshed out view of it. It's just an access point. It's just an on-ramp to be able to really look at your life, really look how you're cognitively wired and go, okay, what's the thing that I am being consistent with that actually might not be me, right? And if I acted not me, what would that look like? And what am I afraid of? What do I fear in being inconsistent with some of these parts? Am I afraid that I'm going to lose my freedom? Am I afraid that I'm going to be vulnerable? Am I afraid that I'm going to be fundamentally wrong and unable to express my opinions or be taken seriously? Am I afraid that I'm going to be out of control in my life and no longer be able to manage my environment for the betterment of others and myself? Like, what is it that I'm fundamentally fearing if I be not me?
As I think about what you're saying in the firm model, I'm going to go through the example of this in my own life just to kind of get an access point for you listening. So as an ENFP, I would have the fixation of freedom, and I will protect a persona for freedom, but I would not experience it that way. I would not tell myself that, like, oh, I have to wear this mask so I can be free in the world. Like, that's not going to be the cognitive thing that's in my head consciously, even though that's the unconscious motivator. What's probably going to happen is I'll have some story I'll say, well, my consistent mask allows me to build up relationships, connections, positions, clients, work, whatever, in the world that generates resource for me, relationships for me, opportunities for me, that will continue feeding into my system of self that allows me to do anything I want, which is ultimate freedom. So I'm not going to say, oh, I wear a mask so I can be free. The closest I can probably get cognitively to that is like initially in the first pass, and you might find this in your own life as you're listening along, which one of the firm model things you fit on, you might have some other story that if you follow down the rabbit trail, you'll find your fixation. It may not be prevalent right in the surface. You might have other things to get to it first. Like for myself, all those things coming into me, resource, relationships, opportunity, that now ensures that I'll be free. But I don't consciously think of it that way ever. That's just something that's running in the background all the time. And so you have to do the work on yourself to see what the conscious story is. Then what's the story below that? What's the story below that? What's the story below that? And you'll probably find your fixation at the end of that road, most likely, when you're going down to look past the mask.
Yeah. Well, but the first step is to realize you have a mask at all.
Of course.
Like, I mean, I really feel like, and thank you for bringing that out, by the way, because it's very personal. You have to figure out what all your bullshit stories are in order to figure out that they're stories at all, to begin with, right? Like, what are the stories I'm telling myself?
Yeah. I mean, somebody may hear what you're saying, Antonia, and not be like, that's not how I do it.
Right.
And it's like, it's hard to see it. Yeah. Because it's not direct. It's going to be like layers behind something else. It's a bunch of stuff between it.
Well, with a bunch of stuff that other people have shoved in there too.
Well, and that's the other point I just want to make really quick. If we're talking about masks in this episode, I do need to make a comment that the masks we wear aren't just the ones we put on. The masks we wear, and you mentioned this earlier, I think, Antonia, or at least alluded to it, we are constantly projecting masks onto people. I mean, think about right now, just call up the image, if you're listening right now, call up the image of the politician you can't stand in your country. Like, think of the opposite party's politician that you think is an evil character. They're horrible. They've got all these terrible traits. Well, you think that because you've projected a mask onto them. You and a bunch of people that think like you have projected a mask onto them. Like, they're not a real person at that point. They're a caricature. You don't know that person. I mean, most likely you don't know that person. You've projected something onto them, and you see them almost like a cartoon cutout of a person. We talked a lot about politicians in this, I guess. But that's what we do with politicians. They are so two-dimensional, they allow themselves to be put in a position where it can project masks onto them. And we're doing this with everybody, not just politicians. That's the easiest example to see in ourselves, because I know politicians. I'm like, look at them like, oh my gosh, these people are cringing. Well, I don't really know them. I don't know the person I was watching on TV doing that ad for our home state to try to be elected. I don't know that person. They could be an amazing person. I could be projecting a ton of stuff about them being in persona I don't know. So that's something I think we need to be mindful of.
Yeah, I would agree. The idea of the more two-dimensional you see other people, the more you're associated with your mask. I think that's the one-to-one correlation I've observed. If you don't like how other people's masks are showing up, if you don't like their personas, and you tend to see everybody this way, that means you probably have a pretty strong mask yourself. And if you're always trying to police other people's behavior, this is the phenomena of adjusting other people's masks. So we run through the world of adjusting our own mask and then adjusting everybody else's masks. And that means you probably have a pretty strong association or attachment to your mask if you're doing that.
And you're going to tell yourself you don't, and you've got all these reasons why not, for whatever fill in subject matter. You're going to have a good reason why you're not doing that.
Right.
I mean, at least I do in my life.
Well, and the other side of it is to acknowledge that everybody has a mask. You know, we're talking about it here. We're like, you know, you should probably see if you're pretty associated with your mask. But I have a mask. Everybody does. And for Jungian archetypes, the persona is one of the pieces. That's the interfacing piece with the outside world. All of us have to have a persona. All of us have to have a mask. And the only people that I know of that don't, they don't interface with the outside world, right? Like the yogis that are, you know, meditating at the top of the mountain with rats chewing off their fingers. Yeah, maybe they don't have much of a persona or a mask, but they also aren't interfacing with the outside world. So if you start interfacing with the outside world, that's just, you know, it's the curated elements of who you are that you like other people to interface with. That's all that means. It's our association, our attachment, and our inability to see how consistent we're being with that curated element. And the fear of not just being that, the fear of being so much more, including all the quote unquote icky parts. That's really where these stories and narratives start to grip us. When we want to rationalize those pieces away, when we want to stay consistent just with the interfacing part, when we always want to see ourselves as the best version of whatever, right? When we want to see ourselves as special or better than, or maybe not better than, I'm not better than, I'm just really special or whatever it is, however you're rationalizing it. Just be aware of it, because there's no real way to completely transcend it. All right? There's no way to get rid of your mask or persona unless you want to be a yogi at the top of the mountain meditating until rats chew off your fingers. I mean, there is that option. But if you're here, my guess is that that's not your goal. So there's really no way to transcend a mask or a persona. The only way to really mitigate it and not make it so wildly out of control and controlling us is by having so much more content in our familiarity with ourselves beyond that mask or persona, recognizing that that's just it's like the Facebook version of it, right? Everybody complains about social media. It's just all curated pictures. It's like, well, yeah, social media is one of the places where we are the most insistent on showing masks and persona. Like that's one of the places, right? That's what the name of the game is. So you're going to see the most there. And seeing so much more of ourselves than that, understanding that really great picture that person put up on Instagram comes with a complete complex life and a complete complex person that has so much more content than just that image. That's how we transcend our mask or persona and not make it jerk us around, not have to be consistent with some narrative or story, because when we add all that content around it, well, then now we have a lot of things to be consistent with. We have a lot more to work with. And to see other people as much more, that's one of the first steps in really showing ourselves or reflecting it back that we're so much more.
We just did a workshop in the last 2 weeks, the time of this recording, in Austin, Texas. Then we did one in Portland, Oregon. We did a live workshop with people, came into a room. It was like meeting up in real life without digital, Zoom calls and stuff. It was really cool. And we were workshopping some of the ways that people wanted to reinvent themselves and go toward the life they wanted. And we did some exercises around how to envision the life you want. And I realized that when people were envisioning the life they wanted, there was not a lot of mask language in there. It was genuine stuff. It wasn't about projecting image. In fact, a lot of it wasn't engaging in the world in any outer way. It was a lot of inwardly focused activities that were restorative and helpful. Now, we have a lot of introverts that come to these events, so there could be something to that. Maybe if we had more extroverts, they'd be more extrovert focused. So
we had some extroverts there.
There were a few there, but that's, I'm just saying, like, I'm holding judgment. I haven't made a pattern yet, but I am noticing that when people really get a sense of what they want to be in their lives and how they want life to go, it usually doesn't include a mask or persona. In fact, the dream is to let that fall and be who you really are. It's really the stepping into and seeing all the parts of you. We started this whole conversation off talking about those 4 parts of self, the persona, the ego, the shadow, and then the self that encompasses all of it. And I think most people really do want a whole sense of self for what that means for them. And I don't think we really want to wear these masks as much. I certainly resent it. I certainly resent the requirement to wear a mask all the time to be able to interface. And I just refuse to do it in most contexts. And some contexts are unavailable to me. I mean, in little simple stuff. I remember 15 years ago trying to get a business deal with somebody. They loved everything I was presenting to them. Me and this partner I was working with, they loved it. At the very end of the presentation, they said, "This sounds great. Where's your business card?" I didn't have a business card to give this person. I lost the deal because I didn't have a little 2-inch by 3-inch piece of paper with my name on it. I lost the deal. Like, everything else was great except for that one piece, that one mask marker, that one persona thing they wanted to see from me was the deal breaker for them. It probably wouldn't have worked out anyway because they required that. I'm sure I'd be offensive in a lot of other ways in not playing the rules nicely, right? But this is the kind of thing, like there's going to be opportunity that closes out from you, but there's a bunch of opportunity that opens up to you as well down this path.
Yeah, I don't think, again, I just want to make a comment. I don't think we can completely ever get out of having a persona because that's the simplified version of ourselves that interfaces with the outside world. But I think what you're talking about, Joel, and I think the goal when we transcend its control over us is that our persona includes a lot more of our authenticity. It includes a lot, like what we're curating is a lot less of an image that we're hoping other people believe about us, and includes a lot more of honest, authentic content about who we truly are.
Yeah, to be fair, we have to be in a podcasting mask right now.
Yeah.
Like we're putting a performative tone. I mean, I don't talk to you like this. I mean, you sort of do. I think our family's annoyed by us sometimes. Our kids are like, "You're not recording a podcast, guys. Stop doing this. This is the dinner table. Chill out." It's like, I understand that we do tend to do that, but we are in a more performative way. We know we have to speak up loudly on the microphone. We have to be careful the words we choose so they're not offensive or confusing. You know, I mean, I might say something casually is a term we grew up with using, you know, like I remember using the term broken home on a podcast once, and someone took a lot of offense to that. It's like, it's not a broken home. I'm like, well, that's the term I grew up with. That's just what wasn't even thinking about it. But I don't use that term anymore. I'm very careful. I have a persona essence to this. I make sure I don't use certain words because I want you listening to be able to hear me and not be disrupted by the words I choose that might be triggering to you.
Right.
Now, there's a limit to how much I'll do that. Like, I do want to speak truth, but there is a persona we're wearing. I mean, I don't think I have a face for radio and I have to wear a mask, actually. but there is somewhat of a, you know, that's a joke, but there is somewhat of a persona or mask we are wearing right now. And anytime you're presenting on stage or anything like that, there's a sense of performance or interfacing you're giving people because that's just how we can interface. So it's interfacing. But I think that hopefully if you've listened to our podcast enough, you know that behind this 45-minute to 1 hour quote unquote performance or performative podcast, we're saying things that ring true for us, that also ring true for you, that aren't just a persona like interface.
Yeah. So looping back to the beginning, first of all, I think you were cute enough to marry 9 years ago. So I don't think you have a face for radio. And also, sometimes being not me is the best way to find me. Sometimes behaving inconsistently with our mask and persona and the narratives and stories we're telling ourselves internally and the narratives and stories we're telling other people outside of ourselves. Sometimes behaving inconsistently with that identity that we've formed, whether it's curated for others or curated for the self, is one of the best ways to discover who you really are. So if you find things in your life that aren't working for you, ask yourself, what is the narrative or story that I believe I have to be loyal to, but actually might not be me? And how can I be not me? And who knows, maybe you'll find a cute guy sitting across the room. And you can go and hit on him and he'll let you. And then 11 years later, you'll be on a podcast talking about it.
Yeah. That might happen to you.
That might happen to you.
Or something else might happen to you. But we do want to hear from you. It's your chance now to be heard, okay? You've been listening to me and Antonia talk. You heard a lot about this idea of persona, mask, ego, shadow, being able to be not me. Have you had an experience of this in your life? Has there been a moment where you said, you know what, I'm gonna not be me in this moment? And maybe you found yourself. Maybe it was a disaster. Maybe you're like, guys, I tried that. It was horrible. I went right back to my persona mask because it was devastating, which is cool too. I mean, I don't know. I don't know your life. I don't know your situation. Maybe that's how it worked out for you. We're subjectively talking about our experience here, but we want to hear from you. Come over to personalityhacker.com. directly below this episode. Leave a comment, ask a question, or more importantly, share your story about how some of these ideas show up in your own life. How has this come up for you or people around you? What have you observed? And what is the story that might help us and other people that listen to this podcast in the community understand more about this subject?
Yeah. Cling tenaciously to the mask and have people pry it from your cold, dead hands.
But that's for all the introverted feeling users out there who, if you tell them to do something, they do the opposite just because you told them to do it. So I'm like,
that's true.
So if I tell them to cling to their mask, they'll be like, wait, I should take this off because Joel said to cling to it. And now they're going to keep it on because I just told them that just gets doubled up.
Ah, you FPs, so fussy. That is accurate. So
I jest mostly.
You're allowed to say that because you're an FP type.
That's right.
But
you can pick on my own.
But we all know that the introverted feeling users are the fussy ones, right? No matter where it's in their stack.
What?
Us introverted thinking types are very rational. We don't have to deal with that.
Of
course. So if you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. If you leave a rating and review for us on iTunes, that helps us out a lot. We have a book. It's called Personality Hacker. You can get it at all major book retailers. And if you leave us a rating and review on Amazon or on Goodreads, that also helps us out a lot. Okay, so we say this all the time. We say this every week. And one of the reasons why we did is because people are like, what? You have things that aren't just this podcast? So we have a suite of programs. They're personal growth oriented, and they talk about growth through the lens of personality types. And sometimes they're game changers, all right? There are people who have come through our programs that have truly found elements of themselves that were leverage points, that have had really transformative experiences. And I can't promise that'll happen to you, right? I mean, we create the programs, we like them. I can't promise that'll be a transformative experience for you. But if you are a loyal podcast listener, I suggest you go try it out. All right, just give it a shot. See if you like one of our paid programs. You might really like the premium content that we have. They're kind of awesome. So head over to personalityhacker.com, and under our program catalog, you will see the whole suite. We have Myers-Briggs starter kits. We have Enneagram starter kits, right, for personality types to go a little deeper, to understand your personality types more. We have body-mind practice courses taught by Dr. Dorian Nardi called Young on Yoga, which talks about yoga, Kundalini yoga, through the lens of Jungian cognitive functions and some of the work that Jung did with chakras in India. It's a super interesting program. For those of you who are intuitive, we have Intuitive Awakening, which helps you leverage being an intuitive and to become the best version of yourself. We also have a couples mapping program that helps you build a stronger relationship to your partner, regardless of your personality type. We have programs for INTJs and INTPs, INFJs and INFPs. Just go check it out. It's really awesome. We would really appreciate if you give one of those a shot, and who knows, it might just move the needle. So head over to personalityhacker.com and check out that suite of programs. See if there's one that is right for you.
My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you right there listening, yes, you, on the next Personality Hacker podcast. If you're focused on personal growth, I think you'll resonate with our core content over at personalityhacker.com. We want to see you understand how your mind is wired so you can generate motivation, improve social skills, find career opportunities, and master excellent decision making. But a quick warning, we are advice and action focused in all of our articles, podcasts, and videos. This means that we attract people who like to be challenged to become excellent, to take action, to put in the work to optimize themselves, not simply just gather more information. If you are committed to personal growth and ready to radically find your inner truth, then come over and be a part of our growing community of like minds at Personality Hacker.